I think we can start, and if people join us a little bit later, we will let them feel bad in the waiting room, so that next time they come on time. Yeah. Okay, Lesetja, thank you very much for being with us. You're most than welcome to start your presentation, and maybe if you could at the very beginning maybe briefly introduce yourself so that the participants know who is teaching them today. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Francisco. And once again, thank you so much for this time. I mean, it's a privilege really to be here with everyone. And hopefully the little that I have to share this afternoon will be, beneficial to those that are here. My name is Lesetja Lekoloane, and I'm from the South African Weather Service with the research group there. But my background is basically in atmospheric modeling. Before that, I was basically working with the model development group as a researcher. So that's basically more or less, what I do. My focus has been on, well, when I was a researcher, working with the research group, I was focusing on a component of the atmospheric model called the boundary layer, basically how to parameterize it in atmospheric models. And as I mentioned recently, I went on to work as a data scientist, working with the application group now. I mean, I'm still working with the model development group, but now my focus is mostly on the application or just product development as a data scientist. Besides that, I'm busy trying hard to finish up my dissertation, which I have to submit, at the Wits University, working with Francois, and I'm sure most of you might know him. He's a great climate modeler there at Global Change Institute at Wits. So that's briefly who I am, and yeah, I'm sure that we can start. I have been asked to, as a part of a lecture on Earth system modeling or Earth system science, I've been asked to give a little lecture on how to use models or model data and observations to answer research questions. I know before me, Robert did have a lecture, just basically showing people how to run atmospheric models. And if I'm correct, his focus was on the CCAM, the conformal cubic atmospheric model, which is something that is becoming popular in South Africa. Now what we're going to do is work with a data, an output of those models. But we won't be focusing on CCAM, we'll be focusing on another data set, but it's similar approach. And not just model data, but observations data. Because at the end of the day, one of the reasons we have all these tools is to be able to answer research questions. So I'm just going to go through a couple of Jupyter notebooks that I have here with me and show you how to work with observation data. We'll be looking at satellite data, and we'll also be looking at sea ice data, which is an output of one of the models run by the CMIP model, which is the conformal, not the conformal, the comparison, international comparison models that are really helpful for the IPCC reports, even one that came out last year. So I'm just gonna move on from here. I'm using Jupyter notebooks. Let me see if I can find those. Okay. I don't know if you can see my screen. What you're supposed to be seeing is...
We can see your PowerPoint.
Okay, let me stop sharing that. I'm just gonna move on to Jupyter notebooks. And I'm not sure if many of you have worked with Jupyter notebooks, but probably in the past 2 weeks, most people used those. They're really helpful.
So all the students had 2 weeks crash course in Python, so they should all be familiar. They're all familiar with it.
That's great. That's great to hear. So as I mentioned, we will be focusing on 2 data sets. The first one, we'll be looking at satellite data, basically trying to see how we can work with satellite data to, answer some research questions. And then secondly, we'll be looking at some model data, from CMIP5 simulations, as I mentioned, and I will explain as we go through the content. And don't worry about the notebooks. I think you can have access to them maybe afterwards. You can just have access to this in the data set that I used here. So starting with the first one, just a brief introduction for those that maybe don't know, where to get some of these data sets. There are some information, or at least links of where you can get that. What we'll be using today is, from NASA. It's from satellite by NASA, which you can access basically on the website that is shown on this notebook. And our focus will be on the sea ice concentration data set. And this data set contains daily sea ice concentrations from 1979 to the present, or recent years. As perhaps something that was mentioned before, when it comes to the earth sciences, most of the time we work with big data sets that span decades, especially when we're talking about climate or climatology. We try to have as many data set as possible, going as far back as possible. And which means that these data sets, can be really difficult to work with, because over the decades, observations have been changing, calibrations or the methods or techniques of observing the atmosphere or any component of the Earth system have been changing. So it's really important that even as you work with this data set, you exploit, and that's one of the things that we will be doing today, to see how you can check some of the information and the history of these data sets. So what we'll be focusing, the data set that is available on this, we have daily, monthly, but you can also access more data sets. I'll show you where to get this, or for this practical course. I don't know if there was an introduction on NetCDF file or format, data format, but in Earth Sciences, and I'm sure Dr. Mbata, who you'll probably meet next week, who will be giving a Python, how to use Python in geosciences. I'm sure he'll touch a bit on this. But this data format is, one of the most popularly used data formats in the Earth Sciences. And simply because in the Earth Sciences we use multi-dimensional arrays. So we're looking at different dimensions. Well, we have data sets containing multiple dimensions that we have to be able to access and analyze at will. So we require specialized data containers, and typically internationally what's used now is NetCDF. But we do have other formats like GRIB. For example, one of the models run at the South African Weather Service, the unified model, gives the output as GRIB, but typically you would have to convert that also to NetCDF, or you can even work with GRIB files. It's not a problem. And with that said, there's an important tool called CDO, which is Climate Data Operator. This is really helpful. As I mentioned, we're working with big data sets spanning decades most of the time, and sometimes you find that you have to grid or regrid some of these data sets for them to to be comparable, and it can be a bit complex to do that with Python. So there has been a tool that has been put together over the years called CDO, which is a Climate Data Operator. And you can read more about that, and you can access even a tutorial, that you can find on this notebook and read more about that. So just a bit of introduction on some of the things that we'll be doing. As I mentioned, that these data sets, well, most of them are freely available. Like one of the models that Robert probably mentioned, WOOF, Weather Research and Forecasting Model, which is freely available. And there are other community models that are available, and they produce data in NetCDF. And most of these contain a given number of records. It can be, if you're looking at NWP or numerical weather prediction timescales, you'll have maybe hourly data available, 6 hourly data available, you have daily data available, and you can even have monthly data that is available. and the number of records is included in the record dimension. So that's something that you need to be aware of. And I'll show you how to access that, using certain commands. And there's no specific convention for names, but it is, customary to use the same name for the record dimension and for the coordinate variable, so that, it's just easy to follow in terms of what you're doing. And we also have the time record, which, we'll also talk a bit more about. Some of the things here you can read for yourself. And one way that, as I mentioned in CDO, to match different data sets, you can simply use the command CDO match time and the files, and then you have the output file. And then this basically, just matches all these different files that you're working with. You can do the same thing if you want to interpolate to a certain grade. And I think when we look at, hopefully we'll have enough time to do so. When we look at another Jupyter notebook where we'll be talking about the model, I'll show you how to regrade, models that have different irregular grades using CDO. Okay, now, basically here it just explains the data set that we're looking at. But yeah, you can read that also. So for what we're doing today, there are certain modules that we are importing. We'll be using XArray. As I mentioned, that we work with NetCDF multidimensional arrays, and XArray is one of the great modules to work with multidimensional arrays. And it's something that you can read these documentations in terms of how to use it even efficiently. And then we're going to use Catopy, which is for using, or at least plotting spatial data or geographical data, using different projections. And then we have another module, which is not really that popular, CM Ocean, that we'll be importing. And yeah, I'll show you how we import that. But for this tutorial, there's an environment that has been created. So in terms of, it will import all the dependencies that are required. And there's a file that is available that I'll also share with you. So everything is here. I've already imported that, but for the sake of those that perhaps don't know, let me just quickly show you how you would do that in this case. Okay, I'm trying to open my terminal. Okay, this, let me try. Okay. Okay. Okay, I think I'm sharing something wrong.
We could briefly see it and then it disappeared again.
Yeah, that's strange. Let me try to share that again. It's supposed to show my, okay, for some reason it doesn't want to share my, what are you seeing? Are you seeing the presentation?
It says Lesetja has started screen sharing, Looks like you haven't completed the procedure for screen sharing. Is there maybe some blue button that you have to click?
From my side, it shows that I'm sharing. Okay, let me try for the last time. If it doesn't, I don't know, I'll try something else.
We don't see a screen now.
Okay, let me try to share again. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, it's not a problem.
It says that you have started screen sharing. It's like somehow maybe we are just impatient and we need to wait a second.
Yeah.
Now we can see it. Perfect. It's there.
What can you see?
We can see a Jupyter notebook with with your file structure where you need to click on something to open whatever you want to show us. Yeah.
All right, no problem. I wanted to open my terminal, but it's for some reason it doesn't want to share. Let me try using the one that is
Okay,
already.
now we can see your terminal within the Jupyter thing. Yeah, perfect.
Yes, awesome. So, so you can get this this file from. I don't know if you've been introduced to GitHub or Git. You can basically clone. Okay, let me show you from mine. Repositories. So we are working with this data set. So you can basically clone it. Just go to code, clone, and then can basically say git clone. I'm not gonna do it. I'm just showing you the command. And then it's gonna clone it, you know, and then you'll have the local repository from there. And once you have that, it's going to be this repository called tutorial CIs. And then when you go in there, it's going to show you the different files inside. This is the first Jupyter notebook. We're looking at the second one. And then we have, basically some more files. The data repository there it's basically showing you where to get the data, and then the environment. So if you open the environment, I mean, this is quite helpful, especially when you're working on multiple projects, to make sure that you know, you have some modules that you need and you don't overload your system. So here you have this environment, and you can basically just create it using Conda. Use this, and then environment. And then when you click this, it's going to create an environment called SI practical. I already created it. And then from there, you will just activate it using Conda activate environment name, which is Conda. So now I have moved from my base environment to my CI's environment. So it will basically use all those different modules that we already need. And then from there, you can open your Jupyter notebook. So I just wanted to quickly show you how to do that. So now I think we can start. But if you have time and you want to do this from your side, you're welcome to clone this repository. I can maybe, okay, let me maybe share this on the chat box, if that's possible. And then you can basically clone this, and you can work with this and do whatever you want. So this has been created by Professor Marcello Vici from the University of Cape Town, and he has given permission to use this. And it's really great in explaining everything that we'll be looking at today. So as mentioned, I mean, the aim of us doing this is not to code. I think it's easy to, well, especially when you start coding, working with Python or different languages, it's easy to just get stuck on writing scripts and codes. But I think the best way of thinking about this is as a tool, and your main concern is to answer questions. Your main concern is not to write scripts and code, but your main concern is to answer questions. And that's what we'll be trying to do. How do we answer research questions in the atmospheric sciences? And CIS is just an example. This can be used. I mean, you can use atmospheric data from CCAM, from WAF, from any model that perhaps you're looking at. And the process will almost be similar, especially if you understand what the end goal is and then what kind of questions you're trying to answer. Okay, so let me do this. Then we can start running this. So the first thing, well, I think what you're gonna get, it doesn't have, well, it will just import. When we run this cell, it will import those different modules, but you might not have this module already, unless if you've activated the environment. But let's say maybe you're working on a different environment, you know, CM Ocean usually doesn't come within Akona. Other modules like Numpy, Matplotlib, they're already there. Caterpie, I don't think it's there. You might have to install it. And one way to do so, instead of using Conda, you can basically use Pip Install. And as an example, let's say you didn't install this or you didn't activate the environment that's there. You're working on a different environment that doesn't have this module. You can basically do that. But ours is good. So we just imported all the modules that we need to use to analyze our monthly climatological sea ice concentration data. And the next thing that we want to do is basically assign the monthly variable. Well, and also we import the calendar module, which we'll be using in our climate calculations. And then here, basically what we are doing is, creating a variable pointing to a directory where our data set is. And on the one of the files or README files or text files, I can't remember which file it is, of the files that you would have downloaded will show you where to get this data. There's a drive, a Google Drive, where you can basically get the data that we are using here. Otherwise, you can simply download whatever kind of data you're looking for from this website. And yeah, you can adjust your directory however you want. And then, one of the things, so what we've done now, we have this data, sea ice concentration from 1979 to 2005 that we have imported. And we want to, one of the good practices when you're doing research is not just to take data and then start plotting or doing operations, but really trying to understand your data, right? And most of the time, the data that you would get in the earth sciences that's already, in the public domain would have metadata, basically information about the data, and it will tell you more about the data, where it's from, who created the data, when, and all those things. So we opened using Xarray. We're using this module Xarray here, as you can see, and right now we just want to see what's the information about the data that we're just using, and it will show you here that we are working with longitude, latitude, and time. And as you can see, time is 12. So, well, one of the things that this hints to is that this might be monthly data. And then, yeah, those are the latitudes and longitudes. And then it tells you the variable that we have, as you can see here, it's sea ice concentration. And this is very important, the attributes. And I think most of us, it's easy for us to skip this part. Under the attributes, you would see, the kind of data you're working with. But most importantly, what I think, I'd like to point your attention to is the history here. Most of the time, the data you have, especially if it's been moving around a lot and maybe some people have worked with and you have to work with, whenever you save it or you manipulate it, automatically there is a history that gets attached to it. And we can be able to trace back where it's coming from, what happened to it, and yeah, just basically to make, in a sense, some kind of quality control to make sure that the data you have, it's what you're looking for. And here, as you can see, here there was a CDO that was, the CDO command that was used to manipulate this data on the 15th of September, 2016. And you can see another one here, 1st of August, but the latest was 15 September. And you can even go back in time, just basically seeing snapshots of what's been happening with this data. So that's very important because that will tell you whether, what you're analyzing, or even the end product of your analysis, how reliable is it, and is it good data or is it bad data? Or maybe you might have to apply certain operations to get it ready to whatever you're trying to get it. And it will show you basically where to read more or get more information about the data, in this case, here, which is that website that I showed you in the beginning, where you can also download the data from. And the CDO also, you can read more about that there. And from the history, we can find out the post-processing done on the data as I mentioned. And yeah, that's very important in you working with the data that you have. So now we will now check the content of the variable, by printing this CS concentration variable. This is the variable that we have seen here. So basically, well, it doesn't show the entire name here, but that's the name of the variable. It can be any variable. Let's say it's temperature, or maybe you're working with one of the popularly known data sets in the earth sciences now is error 5 or error interim. You can do the same things, try to understand what's happening there. You have certain variables, perhaps you have downloaded. Let's say it's temperature. When you get here, you'll basically call that variable name, which would be temperature. And when you do so, it will show you, just the variable that you have and the dimensions of that variable. And in this case, you can see you have the time, latitude, and longitude attached to that variable. So which means you can basically call, certain, let's say, months here, or certain latitude and longitude of that variable. So it's multidimensional. And yeah, that's very important. So you can read more about sea ice concentration, but one of the most important things with regards to the data set that we are using is that, as you can see up here, the percentage, or even when we start plotting, you'll see that the values typically would be larger than the expected percentage, which is something that is not, in the metadata. If you look at the metadata here, it doesn't show you any information about the percentage of the sea ice percentage. But it's something that you will find in the documentation. And this is the extract from that documentation to say that data, or in particular when it comes to the data set we're working with, data are stored as 1 byte integers, representing sea ice concentration values, and that the sea ice concentration data are packed into byte format by multiplying the derived fractional sea ice concentration floating point values, which will be between 0 and 1, well, 0.0, which is floats, and by scaling factor of 250. So that's why, you'd have concentration, sea ice concentration of more than 100%, which in the physical science point of view, or even in the mathematics, it wouldn't make sense. But if you have this information, you'll be able to manipulate your data, very well. And this is one of the reasons why here well, first of all, with the data set that we have, we'll have to divide to convert to the fractional parameter ranging from 0 to 1. We'll have to divide, by 2.5. And this is something that you wouldn't know unless you have looked at your metadata and you have printed this variable to see just basically the information regarding your variable. If you don't know this information, you'll go on and do your analysis and plot, and you'll be surprised that what you have, it might look nice and beautiful, but it wouldn't be scientifically correct. So that's why it's very important to try to understand your data before you use it. I think that should be the takeaway from all of this. Make sure that you understand your data before you use it. Don't assume that your data is correct, but look at it and make sure that it is what it's supposed to be. So basically now we are going to divide by 2.5 to basically convert this back to the fractional parameter range from 0 to 1, right? And then that's what we are doing here. And when we do so, you would have some non-values that are created, which is basically masked values that are more than, what we're looking for. So they will be masked, and it will basically show them as none values. So now this is our data set, our new data set, which we have stored in the field variable here. So now we can start doing some operations and plotting. We can now take advantage of the multi-facing facility offered by Xarray. As I mentioned, that this is one of the greatest modules to use to work with multidimensional data set, especially in CDO. We can use that now to visualize the 12 months in the file and look at the seasonal cycle. I mean, this is just an example. It doesn't matter what you're looking at, but in this case, we're trying to look at the seasonal cycle of the sea ice, concentration over that period that we're looking at, which is 1979 to 2005. And to map that, we are going to use this module that we have imported called CHPC. And you can even read more about this. I think the nice thing about Python, or at least, one language that I would say that you could use. I mean, there are others you can use like R and whatnot, but Python there's a lot of information online. I mean, for example, CHPC, if you don't know CHPC, you can just literally go to Google CHPC, and then you'll find documentations, you'll find tutorials. You can find almost anything you're looking for. And it doesn't really matter which field, because most of the things are kind of similar. So in this case, CHPC is one of the modules we use to plot geospatial data that we use in the earth sciences. And so the particular projection that we have here is South Polar Stereo. And you can read more about that also. What we are doing here, I mean, we are basically trying to plot and label our figures, So yeah, it's not really something complex. So I'm just going to run this, and let's see what we have. Right, so now what we can see, this is, Antarctica. We can see the sea ice concentration, plot. If you had perhaps, plotted this without converting your data back into percentages, then you are going to have sea ice concentration that goes beyond 100%, which wouldn't make any sense. So that's why the main point of what I'm trying to show you is not to plot this. Although this might look nice, even for publications, but if it doesn't make any it doesn't make any sense scientifically, then yeah, we don't need to plot this. So now we have the sea ice concentration in terms of percentages. Yeah. So I don't know if there are any questions with regards to that. If there are no questions, I can continue. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, or you can even type.
There doesn't seem to be any question at the moment.
All right, that's no problem. So now we are going to look at the seasonal cycle of sea ice extent. So what we have here is the sea ice concentration, in the Southern Ocean. I mean, one of the reasons also this is an important region now, it's because of, climate change, and one of the many studies actually are starting to show that, the Southern Ocean plays a key role in the control of the climate system. So yeah, being able to analyze different parameters in the Southern Ocean will be helpful. And this is just an example using sea ice. Now let's look at the seasonal cycle of sea ice extent. We with the sea ice concentration done, now we want to plot the seasonal cycle of the sea ice concentration. And, you know, in our case, we're just going to continue in Antarctic. I mean, most of the studies have been done in the Arctic, which is in the Northern Hemisphere. So we are going to create, or at least extract concentration values and convert those into fractions. Yeah, so we need to convert the sea ice concentration into the actual area. And if the concentration is lower than 15%, the area will be, you know, considered as 0. And if it's greater, it will be assumed that the cell is fully covered. And the actual area will come from the product between sea ice concentration and the area. So this is the operation that we are doing here. And it shows you the type. And then it shows you all even the shape of the variable we're looking at. So now, you know, here we see like we have, you know, 3-dimensional, still 12 months here. And we have other 2 dimensions, which means this will be 3 dimensions, which is the same as the sea ice concentration that we saw here, that it's 3-dimensional. Where's that? Here. So it's still the same. Yes, so it's still, you know, the same 3-dimensional data that we're looking at. And then the sea ice extent is calculated by creating an array of sea ice presence or absence, you know, and decretizing the concentration values according to the threshold. As I mentioned here, you know, this is what we're trying to do there. Just saying that, okay, if it's lower than 15%, then the area will be 0. And if it's greater, then, you know, the area will be considered to have, you know, yeah, be fully covered. Okay, let's do that and see what we have here. I mean, the plot that you have, this might look like a strange plot. But yeah, you know, I mean, one of the things it looks strange is because the Cartesian representation of this matrix is upside down. So you have the continent here, and then you have everything below that. And I mean, someone who doesn't understand where you're coming from wouldn't understand what this is. So to compute the sea ice extent, we need to know the area of each grid cell and then add them up. And the array coordinates are geographical, and we can check the size of each cell in the following way. You know, we'll do the difference between, I mean, looking at the latitude, just calculate the difference there, or the distance. Same thing with the longitude, and then we can just print them out to see. There we have our cell showing that it's 0.25 degrees. That's the length scale or the resolution of our data set. But I mean, the cells are regular in the geographic, you know, projection that we're using there, up there, which is, yeah, also the resolution is 0.25. However, the length in kilometers of 1 degree latitude is constant, while the length of 1 degree longitude depends on the latitude, which we know, that's why working with projections can be a little bit tricky, because the Earth is not flat and it changes, you know, as you move in the longitudinal direction. So here what we are doing is to, you know, compute the area as an array with the same dimension as the input data. So, and we can run this, and we're going to use this to calculate the area that we'll be looking at. So we just run the cell, and we have the area calculated using those operations there. And the sea ice extent, you know, will be the sum of all the cell areas. Okay, now let's look at the shape of of the area. Okay, so now we see that the result is an array with 12 values. Yeah, from here, if you go back even with the different cells that we looked at, one of the things you'll notice how the sum is done on the spatial dimensions. And I mean, as you can see here, and now we can plot monthly time series, using the data that we just, using the data that we just created with the operations that we applied there. Now we can see that the CI's concentration, just the time series, it's variable, from January and up to the, towards the end of the year, it varies. It seems a bit significant, but yeah, so that's how you do that. Let me just quickly save that data. Now, Antarctic sea ice has been divided in several sectors. From the literature, it's something that we can see, and you can read even more about that on the link that's there on the notebook. And since the data are on a regular grade, it is relatively straightforward to compute averages over a region identified by longitudinal limits. I mean, as I was trying to explain before, that the main point is not to write scripts and plot. That's the means to an end. We are trying to understand, we're trying to answer questions. So one of the things you do is understand your data, understand what you're trying to do, and you'll be able to figure out ways of how to get there using, Python. So that's what we're doing. So here we're defining our regions in this case. So because we're working with this kind of data and we know from the literature that there are different regions, we can divide our regions, based on their longitude and latitude as we know them in the literature. And that's what we are doing here. And then we name them. And then from there, we start defining the array holding the monthly CIS extent for each region right here. And then we have just a loop there to enumerate based on certain conditions. And then we can run that and see what we have. And then plot it. So this basically now shows you the seasonal cycle of sea ice extent over different regions that we have from the, using the data that we have. I don't know if there are any questions, and if they are not, we can move on to the next part. So this was basically just showing you an example of how you would analyze observational data. In this case, we're looking at satellite data and trying to calculate, some or at least analyze some sea ice concentration and sea ice extent. And the most important part, at least for me, the most important part is not necessarily these plots that we have done there, but this part where we try to analyze or understand our data, because with that in mind, we are able to do certain operations to get our data to what it's supposed to be. Without this step, you can have nice plots, you can have nice, time series, but they wouldn't be scientifically correct. All right, so we can continue to, unless if there are any questions, we can continue to look at an example of how we would work with model data and compare that with satellite data, which is something that is common in the earth sciences, or at least atmospheric sciences, where we trying to maybe compare or do some verification or try to understand how the models are performing, and usually would use observational data to try and verify our model data and see where they're lacking. So that's what we'll be doing here. We'll be looking at sea ice concentration still, but now as simulated by a climate model. And one of the things that I want to show you even through this, which is common when you work with model data in the earth sciences, is irregular grids, how to deal with irregular grids, which can be quite difficult. Yeah, as I mentioned, the issues of projection and how the earth, is, even as you move towards the poles and as you move towards the equator, you'd have, yeah, it's quite different. So there are different ways you can go around that, and I'll show you one of those. And from there, we'll just compare model data with observational data that we already have. So yeah, the model data that we'll be using for this example is from CMIP5 simulations, which we performed, before the ones that, helped IPCC last year. I'm sure that many people are familiar with IPCC and CMIP. Yeah, just CMIP data. And there are many models submitted, to CMIP. But what we'll be looking at in particular is the CMCC, which is a model that was developed in Italy. And one of the popular ones is NOAA, and I mean, it doesn't matter the kind of model. This can be CCAM, as Robert was showing you the other day how to run CCAM. It can be CCAM data, or it can be any model data. Yeah, so you can also find this data. You can read more about that, how to find that data in this text file. README, yeah. So we'll do the same thing. We are going to import the modules that we're going to need, which are similar to the previous ones. And then here we are pointing to those directories, and then we are opening it using Xarray. And then we look at the metadata as we have done before. I mean, this is the first step. You can see our data dimension. We can see the variables that are there. And most importantly, as I mentioned before, look at the attributes. You can see here the operations that have been done, or the manipulation that has happened to this data, over the years, the latest being 2020 on the 27th of January. You can see the history of that. And perhaps you can see that, oh, maybe they've calculated means from this, monthly means from daily data or hourly data, and you can see if it's something that you'd be interested in working with. And you can read more about, just where the data comes from, and just details with regards to where to find that information also. So what we are going to do also, as we have done previously, let me just quickly scroll there. Yeah, we're still exploring the data that we have to understand the kinds of, variables we're working with, the kinds of units we're working with. As you can see, we still have the CIS concentration. Okay, now we know, and the data types here. You have date time and your floats representing latitude and longitude, and more information about the model data also. So the first thing we're going to do is, here what we're doing is the projection. I mean, just using Catopy to plot our data into a map using the Robinson projection. So Catopy has there are different projections you can choose there. Depending on the kind of data you're working with, depending on the region you're focusing on, because that will tell you which projection might be best. No, I don't think any projection is perfect, but depending on where you're working, which region you're working on in the world, you can try to get us to the closest possible accurate projection. Okay, now let's plot this data that we have. So when we plot this data, what we see here is, if you look at this, you can see that, I mean, you have this masked areas, it's like black, and then you have, I mean, it wouldn't make sense to someone, okay, what's happening here, you know. And this happens because of the projection. I mean, if you look at, for example, the continents here, you look at the Asia and Europe, you look at, they don't seem to be, yeah, as good, you know. And this happens because, you know, main ocean models, in this case, you know, as I mentioned, we're looking at sea ice concentration. Main ocean models, even atmospheric models, like, you know, your CCAM, have irregular grids. And in this case, this grid, you know, it's Oka grid, which is a tripolar grid where the grid singularity at the North Pole has been solved by duplicating it and shifting it on land. So you'd have, if you look at this image here below, you can see that what happened is people who developed this grid basically were trying to focus on a certain part of the Earth. And to do so, they moved, you know, some grids, or they stretched some parts of the Earth and shrink some parts of the Earth so that they can get details, more details where they're focusing on. In this case, you know, just there in America, you can see that the grid is different than in Asia, and you have Asia being stretched. So that's very important to note. So how do you work around irregular grids, whether it be CCAM or any other model that comes with irregular grids? One of the best ways is, you know, well, I suppose it's the only way is to remap or to regrid, you know, and this is one of the ways that you do that. You can do that with Python, but as I mentioned in the previous example, it can be a bit complex. And as I mentioned, our aim is not to code, unless if you enjoy writing many complex scripts, but our aim is to answer questions, research questions. So we have CDO, which, you know, can be used to regrid this data. In this case, you know, using bilinear interpolation. So we applied this operation to our data to interpolate our data, or to regrid our data. So now what this does here, what we are doing here is basically remapping, you know, our grid so that we can be able to visualize it. And what I'm going to show you, it's not something that you'd necessarily publish. What we have here, well, we just remapped, and now I just plotted this. This is, yeah, you can use this maybe to check, you know, for your own analysis, to see, your data, how it's like and all that. But this, yeah, you cannot publish this. It still doesn't make much more sense to someone who perhaps is not seeing you creating this data. So here basically it explains, just different interpolation methods. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, like linear methods, bilinear, cubic, nearest neighbor, and all these different kinds of interpolation. And I mean, the best interpolation would be, well, it will differ with situations. But depending on what you're looking at, it might be good to use linear sometimes. Or you can use bilinear, depending on your data, or nearest neighbor, you know, to do so. And there's a package in Python that comes with SciPy, which I'll show you, you know, where you can find these different interpolation methods. So what we're gonna do, or here I'm just assigning. So, and interpolating here. And what we're gonna do is now import the SciPy, interpolate the site. Well, we're gonna import grid data from SciPy. I'm sure many of you might know what SciPy is. It's one of the modules, one of the greatest modules actually, especially when you're working with, or you're trying to interpolate or regrade your data. And we are going to regrade our CI's data using the nearest neighbor methods. And that's what we are doing here. Now, okay, it's still loading there. But as it's still loading, yeah, here basically just we are choosing the map projection, South Polar Stereo, which is what we used previously. And then now here we are plotting our data, assigning variables. So yeah, just all these different attributes that we want to see. Then when you plot that, you can see now. I mean, this was for you couldn't publish this, but this is actually similar to this. It's just that now it's in such a way that people can understand and it's been regraded, which is something that you can now, publish or it makes more sense. So here we're just going to save that again. And now we are going to call another data from other models. As I mentioned, the models that we're using here, I mean, there are many CMIP models, but now we're focusing on this 4. MCC, the NOAA, GFDL, Triple CMA, and CIRO. So that's what we're doing here. We're just gonna load those. And then again, important, before you can even go on to doing or applying operations, you need to look at your data. What do you have? Your variables, your attributes. Is it good enough for you to work with? And then from there, we are going to do what we did before. We're going to mask those values that are that we don't want to appear because we're looking at CI's concentration, and we know that our data, CI's concentration, the percentage is more than 100. So what we're doing here is converting that back, and then, sorry, I went back there. So here we're doing the same thing when it comes to areas, and we're looking at the shape, 3-dimension 2, and the shape, also the CI's extent, which is similar. This is similar to what we did this side. So what we did this side. So if you don't understand what I've been saying, it's basically the same as what we're doing here when we're trying to find our CI's extent from CI's concentration. Now we can plot that. And yeah, we're able to compare the CMCC model and the NCDC data, and we can see that it's, I mean, there are differences, but it's almost similar. And now what we can do the same thing as we've done here, but for all the different models that we've interpolated. I mean, we have imported. Most of you would know these ones: Access model, CAN ESM, GFDL. So we create a loop. I mean, you can write, you don't have to create a loop, but obviously this is more efficient. We can do this for all the 4 models on separate lines, but you'll have a very long code. So to solve that, we basically interpolate and enumerate the results. And I'm sure, I don't know if you went through this before. If you haven't, maybe Dr. Mbata might look at this next week when he talks about how to use Python in geophysical, just to do operations in geophysical data. So run that cell, then now we can plot the different models. And we can see that these models are good. Compared to the observations, you can see that, well, they're not as observations, but they are close to the observation that we have in NSIDC, that purple. And even in terms of seasonal cycle, they do show that seasonal cycle as observed. I don't know if there are any questions.
There is a question in the chat, Lesetja.
Yes.
What is the difference between X arrays and Numpy arrays?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
The question by Mpumelelo is, what is the difference between X arrays and Numpy arrays? Or
Yes.
Yeah. So it's a Python question.
Yeah. Okay, let me go to the text to see what. Okay, what's the difference between X array and Numpy arrays? Oh yeah. So yeah, I think you know, I mean there are several important differences. I think one of them would be that Numpy arrays have a fixed size at creation. And X arrays, I think, well, there's a question actually. Do we have to import X array to work with our data set? I think it depends, One of the nice things about using X array instead of the Numpy array is that this is specifically, created to work with multidimensional arrays. And specifically, in our case, NetCDF files, it's easier to work with X arrays because you do have functions that you can use to perform certain operations that might not necessarily be readily available with Numpy array. You probably can work with, Numpy still, but I think it's much more easier if you were to use the module that is specifically created for that purpose. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but I'm sure that, at a deeper level, there are also differences, and which I'm not sure about, but maybe Dr. Mbata can even explain more next week when he looks at how to use Python to answer geophysical, to do some, work with geophysical data. So at a very basic level, I would say that, X arrays in our case would be more advantageous because there are already, functions that are readily available for us to use with our kind of data.
Thank you for the explanation. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I don't know if there are any more questions.
Sorry, I muted myself. There is another question by Mpumelelo in the chat. Can you suggest a general workflow that can be employed in developing climate change models?
Can you what? So I didn't get that.
Can you suggest a general workflow that can be employed in developing climate change models? And Mpumelelo, if you wish, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question in person. Yeah.
Yes, that would be much more helpful. If you are able, Mpumelelo, can you maybe ask or maybe clarify what you mean?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, it's actually quite noisy where I am, but I'm basically asking if can you sort of like suggest a general framework or workflow that can be used whenever we have to build like climate change models. Is it similar to the general data science workflow? Because I saw that there is the models related to more technical than general data science projects, even though it's still data science. But can you like suggest, because you emphasized mostly on we should focus on scripts and more on answering questions and generating questions. So what's the general workflow that we can employ, sort of like a plug and play system to develop models, even automate them?
Yeah. Thanks for that. That's a tough question. I think, one of the reasons I was emphasizing that our main goal is not to write code, but to answer questions. is because of the context. I mean, as a researcher, what you're trying to do is not necessarily write scripts to, I mean, Python or any other language is a tool that you use, to work with your data. That's what I meant by answering questions. But I think even as a programmer, you're answering questions. Anyways, I think it's quite difficult because I think the workflow would depend on where the models are being developed. I don't know. I claim to be an expert. I've never developed a model, a climate model. I mean, those are very complex, and there are multiple teams working on this, spanning over decades. Even in South Africa now, there's an effort to try and at least have our develop models, and starting with the CCAM, which is a model that we can easily work with, try to understand. But there are multiple components that different people would be working on. So I wouldn't say there's a general workflow, but I suppose, I mean, from a developer point of view, you would still follow the development process or the development cycle.
In fact, I wanted to focus on the complexity of developing these models. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, and how do we include like mathematical fields like dynamic systems, for example? Because the first time I focused on weather modeling, there was this term, the butterfly effect, associated with how climate projections are sensitive to initial conditions. So how do you account for that when you develop models?
Yeah. So yeah, if there's anyone interested in answering, jump in. So, I mean, the model, basically, there are mathematical equations used, to represent the flow of the atmosphere. These are Navier-Stokes equations. These are dynamic equations which are used, to basically, represent the flow of the atmosphere, for example. As you're saying, I get your question. When you talk about things like butterfly effect, there are more questions around that, the initial conditions. So I think there are more questions that you're asking in one, but maybe let me try to answer them separately. So models are written using mathematical equations, right? You have mathematical equations, describing the flow of the atmosphere. Thinking about winds, for example, you'd have an equation, trying to calculate the winds. These are mathematical dynamic equations that you can find even online, based on Navier-Stokes equations. But the problem is that some of the processes are not resolved because of the resolutions. These equations are not, explicitly shown there. You use mathematical techniques like discretization. So they're discretized on a grid cell. And that introduces things like, resolution, which would mean that some of the processes won't be resolved. Particularly, personally, I work mostly with boundary layer, which is turbulence, which is one of the most difficult things to work with, because you have what we call eddies, as an example. We have eddies which are larger, and we have eddies which are smaller. It is basically turbulence in the atmosphere. So the larger ones can be resolved explicitly by the equations, because they span maybe the grid cell. And then you have those smaller ones. The larger ones can be, kilometers, and then, the smaller ones can be even millimeters, which wouldn't be resolved by the model. But the thing is, for the models to be more accurate, you need to resolve those because of the energy cascade that happens, between those different eddies or turbulence. So you would use a method called parameterization in that case. So you have dynamic equations which are discretized in a cell to solve the atmospheric flow, and then you have those processes that are not resolved, perhaps because of the grid cell or the resolution of the model. Those you would parameterize using equations still. Basically, from our physical understanding of the atmosphere, there are relationships that perhaps we know that, okay, temperature increases with height generally. This is just a very example. decreases with height, but when you have an invasion, it will increase with height. So how do we deal with this? And then there are some relationships established, experiments done to find some certain values to try and see how to best parameterize. So parameterization, it's basically something that is not necessarily accurate, but something that is as close to accuracy, to what is true as possible. So that's the first thing I can say. Secondly, you're talking, when you talk about the butterfly effect and all that. So those models typically would be deterministic. By that, I mean that having one input, you'd expect a certain value, but dynamic system, the atmosphere is dynamic in nature, which means it operates like dynamic systems, where basically, you can run, initial conditions, are very important, to your output. And if you have a slight change, then your output would deviate significantly. But in climate models and weather models would be different, like numerical weather prediction, which is typically what is used for your day-to-day weather. Now they're pushing it up to 10 days. But those, in that case, your initial conditions would be very important. And nowadays, there's a field that is developed and really has really played a role in improving models called Ensemble Models. So basically, there are different ways. You change initial conditions, or you can use different models. But typically, you would have a slightly differing initial conditions, simply because those initial conditions, would come with errors. They're not necessarily accurate. So they would slightly change those initial conditions and to try and find the values. So ensemble modeling, you can Google that. Ensemble modeling, it's another technique. It's a different field on its own. But in climate models, typically you would use boundary conditions. So you would have, we know that, for example, sea surface temperature plays a role in controlling the climate system, and you would work with that kind of data. And in mathematics, you do have boundary. You have initial conditions and boundary conditions. So those are two different approaches that will be used. I don't know if I answered your question. I think your question is more. There's more to say, I guess. But it's not an easy thing to develop a model. It's not like you can just wake up and be like, okay.
Thank you very much. I was very loaded, but thank you very much.
Awesome, Dumela.
We have one more question by Zizipo. And please, Zizipo, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question in person. I think that gives a little bit more of a lively interaction feel to the meeting. And I think Dr. Mbata made a comment in the chat that I only saw now because it was in between the two questions about the question of X-array and Numpy arrays. And he says that the Numpy array can only have one data type, while the X-array can hold heterogeneous data. Yeah, so just to clarify the previous discussion. And Zizipo, you're welcome to ask your question in person.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Hi.
Yeah, it's just a curious question. I don't know much about this stuff, but I just wanted to know what is this data that he just showed us telling us exactly about the CI's concentration?
Okay, so okay, I get your question. Thanks for that. This was just an example, but well, I see even here on the chat, talking about whether it's decreasing and global warming and different things. A lot of work has been done in the Northern Hemisphere, for example, where you have, it's been shown over the years that sea ice concentration is, decreasing. And this has been attributed to increasing temperatures. And now there's work being done in the Southern Hemisphere. Models generally struggle with representing that. in the Southern Hemisphere, particularly there in Antarctica, because there's still so much that's not understood. But in terms of the sea ice concentration from the data we looked at, it's just an example. And generally what you need to know is that, first of all, it's variable depending on the seasons. Now we are in the summer season. And well, in South Africa, we're heading to winter soon, but sea ice concentration would, okay, let me actually go there. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see my screen. So,
yes.
Okay, from the data that we looked at, for example, this one, you can see that, well, we're looking at the seasonal cycle, right? The seasonal cycle over the different regions of in Antarctica, the Ross Sea, Amundsen Sea, Weddell Sea, and all those things. First of all, you notice that it's variable. There's a seasonal cycle. During summer, in the Southern Hemisphere, like now we're in February, so you can see there, it's at almost minimum. And then as you go to winter months, it starts to increase, and only starts to go back to, or start to decrease after winter, heading to summer. So that's what we're not looking at the trends, but the literature does show that. In Antarctica, I'm not claiming to be an expert. As far as I know, in Antarctica, there's still a lot of questions to be answered. But yeah, in Arctic, in the North Pole, it is decreasing. But yeah, I don't know.
So basically, this data is seasonal. This is what we would expect anyway. It's not caused by external factors or humans or anything. It's just what we would observe in seasons.
Yes, basically that's what we're looking at, the data. We're looking at how sea ice, sea ice extent or concentration, would vary over the seasons.
Okay.
And I think maybe Dr. Mbata will look at, he's one of the best people I know when it comes to time series analysis, those are really important in helping us answer the questions that you're what you're asking in terms of, okay, what's happening, what are the trends, and all those questions.
So if let's say in that data, because now it's summer seasons and we do expect the sea concentration to be low, if suddenly they would be high, then we'd know that there's something that's affecting it besides seasons.
Yeah, I think it's not a straightforward question, because just because there's this seasonality or seasonal cycle, it doesn't mean that it's it will vary. There's variability that is internal to the climate system itself. An example would be, I work with weather, right? An example would be, let's say in winter we're not expecting thunderstorm. Well, according to looking at the climate or over the decades, we're not expecting thunderstorms in the eastern parts of the country, right? But it doesn't mean that you won't have any thunderstorm. It basically says that, when you look at the climate time scale, what's normal is for thunderstorms not to occur.
Not to be there.
Some of the year. So in the same, yeah. But obviously, sea ice is something much more. It's not like weather where you'd have, because temperatures play a role, and it's something that takes time to melt. There's also the complexities of ocean, let's say temperatures and the mixing layer in the ocean and all those things. But yeah.
So do the models take into account those things that you might observe something very different from like a trend you'd expect? So do the models take that into account and maybe correct themselves for that?
Yeah, I think that's what they're trying to do. But it's not an easy thing. Especially when it comes to sea ice concentration and the Southern Ocean, because there isn't much known. Remember, these models are developed, from what we understand from a physical science, point of view. And then from there, you would have the mathematics behind it, and then you would put that in the model. But if you don't understand, the science or what's happening,
then you can't put it in the model.
Yeah, so you would assume certain things, perhaps, as far as theory would tell you, and all that, I think.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Great.
I don't see any more question in the chat, or I don't see any more raised. There is one raised hand. Sorry. Dr. Mbata, please, you're most welcome. Sorry, I didn't see it.
We can hear you, goodness.
We see that you are unmuted, but we can't hear you. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
There is I don't know, maybe there is an issue with the microphone. Yeah, it's his microphone. Sorry. Okay, so I'm lucky we have a few days to sort it out before next week. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Dr. Mbata will make his comment next week when I think he will spend two sessions with us, so there will be enough time to listen to his comment. And sorry that there is this technical hiccup that happens all the time. Yeah. Here we go. Do you want to give it another try? Okay, I'm sure. Maybe it's the raised hand from before. So, Lesetja, I guess this is the end of your presentation. Thank you so much. It was really very interesting. I'm a theoretical physicist, and I've never worked on climate change modeling or Earth system modeling. And I thoroughly enjoyed this lecture series because it gives us a very nice insight in how the machinery works, in the prediction of weather forecast and climate change modeling that all of us are interested in, but most of us don't really know the details of how it works. So thank you very much to you and to your team, for sharing with us this knowledge. I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of all the participants that are with us today. So no, thank you very much. It was really excellent. And if you are willing to share your slide and your notebooks, we can make them accessible to the students on Moodle, if you are happy with that.
Right, no problem. It was a pleasure being here, and yeah, it's been great having the interaction also now.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Francisco.
It's really very nice. And, it took us probably a few lectures, but eventually the students start asking questions. That's very good. If it is in person, it's easier. So online, it's always a little bit, some people are scared. Yeah, so
yeah, definitely.
It's really very nice that that everybody engaged and enjoyed your lecture. So thank you very much again for that. It was really great. Yeah, and I see there are lots of thanks coming up in the chat. So thank you everyone for the.
Thank you so much.
So then. I wish you, Lesetja, all the best. Thank you very much. I hope this is not the last time we see you in this setup. Yeah,
it won't be.
and I wish you and all the participants a very good and restful weekend, because Monday at 9 o'clock we are back into action. Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good weekend, and I'm looking forward to interact with you again next week. Thank you very much. All the best to everyone. Yeah, and stay safe because there's still a little bit of COVID out there. Yeah, so all the best.
Thank you and goodbye.